What happens when television's sharpest cynical smile confronts a politician who treats every question not as an inquiry, but as a siege upon the very foundations of civilization? The event was billed as a classic political debate for the late-night television era, a dash of satire, a sprinkle of policy, and a few clever jokes to cut the tension. Instead, it became a slow-burn explosion. It was a methodical deconstruction, built on clipped, condescending answers and sharpened, incredulous tones, culminating in a final on-air detonation that sent Senator Ted Cruz stalking off the stage, while the studio audience collectively tried to remember how to breathe. Buckle up, this one moves fast. The band hit a bright, jazzy riff, a familiar sound designed to soothe and welcome. The audience rose like a single adoring wave, and the lights melted into that soft, forgiving glow that daytime television was invented for. Even though this was the far more dangerous territory of late night, Jon Stewart glided to his desk with the weary confidence of a man who could turn a mundane Thursday into a national crisis. He winked at the camera, a smirk that was both a welcome and a warning, a promise to the viewers at home that the comfortable illusions of their day were about to be systematically dismantled. "My next guest needs no introduction," Jon said, his voice a familiar blend of friendliness and impending danger. "He is a lawyer, a senator, a father, and the only man who can start a culture war while selecting a watermelon at the grocery store. Please welcome Senator Ted Cruz." The applause that filled the studio was a cacophony, a perfect audio representation of America's schism. There were enthusiastic cheers from a small, defiant conservative contingent, drowned out by a louder, more curious, and slightly hostile ovation from the majority. Cruz emerged into this wall of sound with a practiced, gleaming smile, his chin tipped at an angle that suggested he was graciously accepting the adulation of a conquered people. He wore a well-fitted but not too expensive suit and a power-red tie, a calculated costume of populist power. He waved, shook Jon's hand with a firm, alpha male grip, nodded at the band, and took his seat as if he had been offered a throne he already owned. "Senator Cruz, welcome," Jon said, settling opposite him. "We are so happy to have you. How is life treating you in Washington these days?" Cruz's smile sharpened, the first glint of the blade. "Washington is efficient, Jon," he said, crossing one leg over the other with proprietary air. "I find I can get from defending the Constitution to exposing media hypocrisy without being slowed down by pesky things like logic." The audience chuckled. Jon shot back a smirk of his own. "Well, a lack of logic certainly saves on travel time," he quipped. "So, what does a normal morning look like for you now?" "Normal is a word people use when they've surrendered," Cruz replied. The tone light, but the message a clear assertion of superiority. "I don't really do normal, I do it intentionally." Jon's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch, a micro-expression of, "Here we go," but he let it pass with a gracious nod. "Intentional is good. You've been very intentional about defending conservative values. Tell me about the project that's on your heart this week." Cruz steepled his fingers, a gesture of professorial authority. "I try not to confine a week to a single project, Jon. But if we must reduce it, it's about protecting free speech, shrinking the dead hand of the government. We're moving systems, not performing for press releases." A gentle rolled through the crowd. Jon kept the atmosphere warm for now. "You've always had a way with phrases," he said. "When you talk about moving systems, what does that look like for the folks at home?" "It looks like they don't need to ask me to define it," he said with a teasing little shrug that was anything but playful. "You know, agency." The drummer in the band shifted on his stool. Jon's smile held a mask of professional calm. He recrossed his own legs, as if the chair had just gotten a touch too small. "Agency is powerful," he agreed. "Let's get specific. You spoke recently about building healthier information ecosystems. What's one practical step you want viewers to try this week?" Cruz nodded, as though testing whether the question was worthy of his consideration. "Stop reacting. Start curating. Unfollow the chaos. Build your inputs like you build a home. You don't invite hecklers to your dinner table. That's a great picture, Jon said, his charm still on full display. And speaking of dinner tables, what does dad duty look like in your house? Cruz's mouth quirked. Duty is a word other people put on you. I prefer presence. I am present. Selectively. A soft ripple moved through the risers. Jon laughed it off. Selective presence. That's parenting with a brand, he joked. Okay, let's talk about the origin story. You've said Washington gave you a fresh start. What did you have to unlearn to take it? He considered, his eyes drifting up to the rigging above them, as if consulting a higher power. Permission, deference, the idea that silence is noble. I retired from apologizing for existing. Retired? Jon echoed, amused. You make it sound like a ceremony. It was, he said, a deadpan delivery. I officiated. A few scattered laughs broke the tension. Jon slid to the next card, his tone still velvet. You've lived under a microscope most of your life. If you could tell the public one thing they consistently misunderstand about you, what would it be? Do I owe them access? He said, the answer quick and clean. Strangers ask for keys to rooms they didn't build. Jon nodded. Still kind. Fair. But sometimes access helps people understand the work. The why behind the headlines. For example, your foundation. Impact speaks for itself, he cut in, smiling. People who need the press release aren't close enough to work. Another murmur. Jon let his hands rest on his knee, palms open, the universal signal of good faith. Let me frame it in a different way. Is there a moment, a constituent you met, a letter you received that reminded you why you're doing what you're doing? There are many, he said. I tend not to convert them into daytime television clips. The sentence landed like a velvet hammer. The audience went quiet, then restarted itself with cautious applause. Jon's smile never moved, but something in the muscles around his eyes tightened. Understood, he said gently. We don't need names, just a heart. Folks at home love hearing the human part. It gives them courage for their own day. Cruz tilted his head, the condescension now unmistakable. Courage is not a broadcast segment, Jon. It's a decision. True, Jon said, but sometimes a story is the spark for that decision. He met Jon's eyes. Or sometimes, a story is a siphon. The cameras found Jon's face, still warm, but now with clouds moving in fast. He pivoted, soft, smart. Let's try this. You've talked about boundaries. What's a healthy boundary you wish you had set earlier? Answering only questions asked in good faith, he said with a bright, harmless smile that wasn't harmless at all. A few people laughed because they didn't know what else to do. Jon's lashes lowered and lifted. A reset. Okay, he said warmly. Then here's a good faith question. When the public hears you speak about institutions, it can sound very sweeping. Is there anything you admire about the world you're trying to reshape? I admire endurance, he said, even when it's misplaced. And the people? Jon pressed, gentle as gauze. Any relationships you hope to mend? I don't mend things that still cut, he said. I will replace them. The room cooled. On the screen, the image was perfect. Two professionals, a glossy set, bright laugh lines. But in the air, a string was being pulled tighter with every answer. Jon breathed in a singer's breath, slow and steady. Last one before the break, he promised. You've used phrases like owning your narrative and curating your inputs. For anyone watching who feels small today, what's one concrete practice you swear by? He smiled, like a teacher who'd just been given a very easy question. Stop feeling small, he said. Stand up properly, edit your circle, decline anything that dims you. If that offends people, they are furniture. A surprised "oh" ran through the audience, half impressed, half uneasy. Jon's smile softened, but his eyes were searching now. That's decisive, he managed with a tiny laugh. All right, y'all, we're going to a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about service, legacy, and what joy looks like for Senator Ted Cruz these days. The applause lights blinked. The band lifted the room with bright brass. The director held the wide shot an extra beat, as if to prove nothing was wrong. But even in the bright lights, you could feel it. The temperature had dropped. The pleasantries had teeth. Somewhere between intentional mornings and furniture, the conversation had quietly turned into a test of wills. Backstage, hands rolled in a product table no one would remember. A PA whispered countdowns. Jon adjusted his cuff and smiled into the middle distance, the way professionals do when they decide to salvage a moment with grace. Across from him, Cruz sat like a man convinced grace was something other people owed to him. They would come back from commercials with the same smiles. The questions would still be soft around the edges, but everyone in the building could feel it now. The tug of a current moving fast under the surface, dragging this bright little boat toward sharper, more dangerous water. The lights came back up, the band faded, and the cameras rolled again. Jon Stewart's smile returned, soft and practiced, but the air carried an invisible static. She clasped his cards lightly, leaned forward just enough, and delivered his next line with velvet ease. "So, Senator Cruz, let's talk about service," he began. The founding fathers often spoke about duty as the highest calling. What does service mean to you now, in this new chapter of your life? Cruz's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Service," he echoed. "People love to dress that word in ceremonial robes. For me, service is choosing not to waste my time. If I invest my time in something, it's because it deserves me." A murmur rippled through the audience, half admiration, half unease. Jon, ever gracious, nodded slowly. "That's an interesting way to put it. So, what kind of service projects feel worth your time these days?" Cruz leaned back, clasping his hands behind his head, as if the chair were a throne. "Ones that move the needle. Not ribbon cuttings, not photo ops. Systems. Big levers. If people don't understand the scale, that's their limitation, not mine." Jon blinked, keeping his smile steady. "Of course, but sometimes the small stories matter too, don't you think? A single family helped. A single child is given hope." He cut Jon off, gently but firmly. "Hope is sentimental. Transformation is measurable. I prefer metrics to feelings." The audience shifted again, some frowning. Jon adjusted his posture, letting his words pass without resistance. "All right," he said warmly. "Let's shift gears a bit. People love to see your human side. You've mentioned being a father. What's one parenting moment that stuck with you lately?" Cruz chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Parenting moments are private currency. I won't spend them here." Jon's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "Fair enough. But even a small anecdote, maybe something that made you laugh." Cruz tilted his head. "I'll give you this. I laughed yesterday at how obsessed everyone seems to be with trivial details of my life." "That's enough of an anecdote, isn't it?" A few uneasy chuckles filtered through the room. Jon's smile flickered but returned. "Well, the public feels connected to you. That's why they're curious. It's admirable." "Really?" Cruz raised a brow. "Admiration is just another word for projection. They don't know me. They know an image. If they admire me, it's because I mirror something they wish they had." The tension tightened further. Jon glanced at his cards, then carefully set them aside. He decided to trust his instincts. "You've often spoken about faith. That's something very personal to many of us. What advice would you give someone out there who feels like they're struggling right now?" Cruz's tone softened, but the arrogance lingered. "Stop waiting for advice. Advice is dependency, dressed up as wisdom. Take action. Get up. Change your inputs. No one's coming to rescue you." A gasp rippled through the front row. Jon's hand twitched slightly, but he smoothed it into his lap. "That's very direct," he said gently. "But sometimes, people need encouragement, not just tough love." Cruz shrugged. "Encouragement is a crutch people like you hand out to keep audiences clapping. I prefer the truth." The applause light blinked, but only half the audience obeyed. The other half sat stiff, unsure whether they were supposed to clap at all. Jon drew a deep breath. "Senator Cruz," he said, his voice carrying a note of steel beneath the silk, "I believe truth and kindness can live in the same sentence. Don't you?" Cruz leaned forward at last, eyes fixed on him. "Kindness is optional. Clarity is not. That's why I left the old guard behind. Too many smiles, not enough honesty." The studio fell silent. Jon held his gaze, his own smile still there but stretched thinner now. "Well," he said softly, "we do appreciate honesty on this show, even when it stings." The audience gave tentative applause. The director signaled for a break, but Jon waved it off with a quick smile, determined to keep going. "One more before we pause," he said. "What brings you joy these days?" "Just pure, simple joy." Cruz's answer came like a hammer wrapped in velvet. "Not having to answer questions like these." The audience gasped audibly. Jon froze, his smile faltering for the first time. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then, with a professionalism honed by years of stage lights and scrutiny, he lifted his chin and gave a soft laugh. "Well then," he said, "we'll be right back after this break." The cameras cut to wide, the music swelled, but the tension didn't fade. It sat there, thick as smoke, promising that what came next would not be a return to sunshine, but a descent into something far darker. When the cameras came back, Jon's smile returned, polished and luminous, but his eyes carried the faintest edge of steel. The audience leaned forward, sensing the undercurrent. Prince Harry sat opposite her, relaxed in posture, but with an unmistakable air of superiority, as though every question were a nuisance rather than an opportunity. "Welcome back," Jon said smoothly. "We're here with Senator Ted Cruz, talking about life, service, and perspective." He glanced at him with warmth, then leaned in slightly. "So, Senator, let's talk about your book. It became a global bestseller almost overnight. What do you think resonated most with readers?" Cruz smirked, tugging at his cuff. "Resonated? I suppose people finally got to hear something other than Capitol Hill-approved fairy tales. I gave them truth, not bedtime stories, and people are tired of bedtime stories." The audience chuckled nervously. Jon kept his smile intact. "It was certainly candid, but some critics felt it painted your opponents in a harsh light. Do you think there's any part of the story you might have told differently?" Cruz's eyes narrowed slightly. "Critics usually come from people who haven't lived a day of my life. It's easy to call something harsh when you're sitting comfortably in your armchair with no cameras, no headlines, no knives at your back." The silence stretched before Jon gently nodded. "Fair, but do you think?" he interrupted. "Do I think? Of course I think. That's why I'm here. If I wanted to parrot polite nonsense, I would have stayed where I was." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Jon's voice softened, almost paternal. "I hear you, but sometimes the audience just wants to connect with the man behind the headlines, the father, the husband. Can you share a little joy? Something light for them?" Cruz tilted his head, a trace of disdain in his smile. "Joy isn't for public consumption. You can't package it into daytime segments. If they want entertainment, they can look elsewhere. I'm not here to perform." Jon exhaled slowly through his nose. He kept his tone steady. "All right then. Let's talk legacy. The Founding Fathers left a powerful mark on the world. How do you hope to carry their legacy forward?" Cruz's posture stiffened. "By not letting their story be reduced to anecdotes on a talk show couch." The audience gasped. Jon's smile faltered for half a second before he recovered. "I mean no disrespect, Senator. The founders are beloved figures. People feel a connection to them. And through you, they want to know their legacy lives on." Cruz leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Their legacy lives on in my choices, not in audience applause." For the first time, Jon's eyes flickered with something more than patience, something harder, but he smoothed it over with a small laugh. "All right, let's turn to the future. You've taken bold steps in your career. Some admire it, some don't understand it. How do you respond to those who say you walked away from responsibility?" Cruz's tone was clipped. Responsibility isn't wearing a pin and waving from a balcony. Responsibility is protecting your family. I don't need approval from strangers to validate that. Jon nodded, though his grip tightened slightly on his cards. Understood, but you've also stepped into media deals, documentaries, public platforms. Some might say that's not stepping away, but stepping into a different spotlight. Any seat? Cruz smirked again. Yes, and some might say the sky is green. People talk because they can't imagine making bold moves themselves. It's easier to critique than to act. The tension in the room thickened. Jon pressed on, his smile now clearly strained at the edges. So, Senator Cruz, what would you say to those who feel you've traded one form of privilege for another? Cruz's response came instantly. I'd say it's none of their business. If they want to discuss privilege, they can start with their own lives before lecturing me about mine. The audience reacted audibly this time, a ripple of surprise and discomfort. Jon took a steadying breath, his eyes locking onto his. Well, he said softly, people look to you as an example. That's why they ask. Cruz leaned back again, folding his arms. Examples are for textbooks. I'm not a case study. I'm a reality they don't want to face. Jon's smile froze, then cracked just enough for the cameras to miss, but the audience to catch. He shifted in his chair, tapping his cards against his knee. Senator Cruz, he said, his voice a little firmer now. I think what people want is honesty, yes, but also humility. Would you agree? Humility has a place in leadership. Cruz's gaze locked onto his. Humility is overrated. It's usually demanded by people who don't have achievements of their own. I prefer authenticity over false modesty. The audience gasped again, louder this time. Jon's chest rose and fell once in a long, quiet inhale. He smiled, but it no longer reached his eyes. All right, he said finally. We're going to take one more short break. It is klaxon wretch to that fine of marrow. The cameras cut wide as the band played them out, but the audience's faces told the real story. Disbelief, unease, even anger. Something was building, unstoppable now, like a storm that had been gathering over calm seas. And at the center of it sat Jon Stewart, still poised, but running out of patience, and Ted Cruz, smugly convinced he had won whatever battle he thought he was fighting. What came after the break would not be polite. The cameras returned from the break. The audience clapped dutifully, but the energy was different now. Less excitement, more dread. Everyone knew they were watching something that could implode at any second. Jon Stewart straightened his notes, exhaled, and flashed a smile at the cameras. Welcome back. We're here with Senator Ted Cruz, he said warmly, though his voice carried a quiet tension. Cruz sat with his legs crossed, posture casual, but expression smug, as if the applause were meant solely for him. Jon leaned forward, still composed. Senator, you've spoken about rewriting your story, owning your narrative, but some people feel your narrative has been at the expense of others. Your colleagues, your country, even your late grandmother. What do you say to that? Cruz chuckled under his breath. I say people love fairy tales until the truth ruins the ending. My story isn't about their comfort. It's about my survival. If that offends them, so be it. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. Jon pressed his lips together, then nodded slowly. I see. But what about accountability? Do you believe you owe your family or the public any reflection, any humility? Cruz tilted his head. Accountability is a tool used by the powerless to restrain the powerful. I've carried burdens none of you could imagine. I don't owe anyone an apology for refusing to stay silent. The audience gasped, audibly. Jon's face didn't flinch, but his voice dropped lower and firmer now. With all due respect, Senator, I think humility isn't restraint. It's respect. Respect for people who look up to you, and for those who came before you. Cruz smirked. Respect has to be earned. And frankly, most people haven't earned mine. The words landed like stones. A collective gasp swept through the studio. Jon's smile vanished. For the first time all night, his composure cracked. He leaned forward, eyes sharp as glass. "You know what, Senator?" he said, his voice no longer velvet, but steel. "Enough. You've sat here acting like every question is beneath you, like every person in this room owes you reverence. But let me remind you, you're not in a courtroom anymore. This isn't the Capitol. This is real life." The audience erupted in cheers and applause. Cruz's smirk faltered, replaced with a flash of anger. Jon pressed on, his voice rising. "You talk about service, but all I hear is arrogance. You talk about survival, but all I see is entitlement. You've been given platforms most people would dream of, and instead of gratitude, you serve up lectures and disdain." Cruz's jaw clenched. "You invited me here, Jon. If you didn't want honesty, you shouldn't have asked." Jon shot back instantly. "Honesty isn't the same as condescension. You've insulted the viewers, dismissed the struggles of ordinary people, and acted like you're still a king in command. But here's the truth. You're not. You lost the election, and the world kept turning without you." The crowd roared. Cruz's face reddened. He started to respond, but Jon's voice cut through, unyielding. "And let's be even clearer," he said, his tone deadly calm now. "You are not one of the founding fathers. They earned love through compassion, humility, and courage. You've traded theirs for self-pity and arrogance. You are not living up to their legacy. You're tarnishing it." The studio went silent, stunned. Cruz's eyes glistened, his composure cracking for the first time. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," he snapped, his voice trembling with fury. Jon sat tall, unflinching. "Then don't. This interview is over." Security stepped discreetly forward as Cruz ripped off his microphone. The cameras caught every movement, his flushed face, his clenched fists, the audience's shocked stares. He stormed toward the exit, muttering under his breath. At the door, he turned back for a split second, his eyes burning with wounded pride, then disappeared off-set. The audience erupted, some clapping, some gasping, others too stunned to move. Jon sat perfectly still, his chest rising with a deep breath. Then he turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "Sometimes respect has to be demanded, and today was one of those times. We'll be right back." The band struck a note, the lights dimmed, and the screen faded to black. What began as a warm welcome had ended in a televised implosion. Ted Cruz leaving in disgrace, Jon Stewart standing tall, and late-night TV history being written in real time. And that's how Ted Cruz's sit-down with Jon Stewart spiraled into one of the most dramatic late-night TV moments ever. What started as polite conversation ended with accusations, a walk-off, and a studio audience left in shock. What do you think? Did Jon go too far? Or was Cruz's arrogance finally too much to ignore? Let me know in the comments below. What is the truth? Who was really at fault in this showdown? The real debate starts right now. Join in by leaving a comment, hit like if you thought this video was dramatic, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the arguments.